We are starting a new series this morning. Ooh. Got a bit of work to do, don't we? We're starting a new series this morning, and we're going to be in this for quite a while. We're going to be going through the book of Acts. And we're going to start, the first section will be from now until Advent, and we're going to do the first 7 chapters of Acts. My hope is that we'll then restart after the Advent season and we'll do the rest of the book of Acts next year. But we'll do it in chunks, don't worry. We're not just doing every week, slogging our way through all 28 chapters of it. It will take us a while. We're going to take our time. But I'm convinced that there's something in this book for us at this time. Now, I think most of us know something about the book of Acts. But I did a very non-official survey. I spoke to 2 people. And it's clear that 75% of those 2 people knew something about the first 10 chapters of Acts and almost nothing about the last bit of Acts, which was really interesting. So I'm convinced that most of us know something about the book of Acts. We might know something about Pentecost. We might even know something about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, or we might know something about the church in Samaria and what happened there, or we might know about Cornelius's house. But once we get into Paul wandering all around the Mediterranean, we get a bit confused about what goes where and what happened. And then if I asked you where the book of Acts ends, I'm not sure many of us know the answer to that. So this is the trick question. Where geographically does the book of Acts end? Anyone got an answer? Oh, you would give us the right answer, wouldn't you? Yes, that's absolutely right. It finishes in Rome. So that's where we're going to finish up. We're going to journey all over the Mediterranean. And at some point, we're going to have some exciting maps for us to look at, but that'll be next year. Don't worry about that. We're going to have big, exciting maps to look at where we can track how the gospel spreads across the Mediterranean and into Europe eventually. And this morning is going to be a teaching morning. I'm not going to preach through a particular passage of the Bible. I want us this morning to leave here understanding something about the book of Acts as a whole, the kind of framework of Acts, so that we have something that we can hang everything else for the next year on, so that we understand what the wider context is, so that we have some sort of shared understanding when we're looking at single bits of it, how it fits with the whole of the rest of it. It's not my favorite way of teaching on a Sunday morning. It's not my space. There are others, I'm sure, who would be better at actually teaching, but I'm going to try and help us to understand what's going on. So what we're going to do is have a quick look at why we're studying this book. Then we're going to have a look at the writing of the book of Acts, then at the composition of it, and then some key themes that run throughout the book. So that's what we're going to try and do, and hopefully you'll leave with a sense of that. And I do have slides this morning that I thought might help, but I should have had little pictures, because Morven gets all excited when I do stuff like this with pictures, but there's no pictures this morning. I'm sorry, it's just boring words. But before we get into that, I want to answer this question: why study the book of Acts now? Okay, this is a book that was written 2,000 years ago. Yes, it's in the Bible, but how helpful is it? Would we not be better looking at one of Paul's letters or something like that? But actually, as I've read through the book of Acts over the last 6 months, there's a huge amount in it that speaks to this cultural moment. You might say, really, Glenn? Well, here's some of the things I've seen. How do we live in the face of increasing opposition to Christianity? How do we practice our faith as a community, not as individuals? How do we do mission in completely different contexts? How does Christian faith work out in the everyday mundane things of life? How do Christians relate to state power? What about theological controversies? What is it to rely on the Holy Spirit in practice? What do we do when there are difficult relationships? How do we actually have courage? What is it to have hope? What is it to have faith? One or two of those questions seem relevant to me for us today. And so that's why we're studying it. These are the kinds of things that we're going to see over the course of, certainly over the next few months, but into next year as well. Because it is alive with stories of real people doing remarkable things. And the strapline for this whole sermon series is this: an extraordinary God working through very ordinary people. It's exactly what we're going to see in the book of Acts. I'll say a little more about that in a moment. So, if that's why we're studying it, how was the book written? What's going on with that? So, the book was written by Luke. Not because he signed it, we don't know that, but what we do know is that it's written by the same person who wrote the Gospel, which is called Luke, but he didn't sign that either. But from the evidence in it, and from the fact that we know that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, which we can see in Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy, we know that he was with Paul. And then there are sections in Acts 16, 20, 21, 27, and 28 where first-person plural is used, which is weird, right? So all through the book, it's as if he's an eyewitness. But then, in these chapters, suddenly we get the word "we" appears. So we know that the person traveled with Paul in some of his missionary journeys. And very in church history, this mic keeps coming and going, doesn't it? Very early on in church history, it was attributed to Luke the physician. And Luke the physician wrote this book probably around about 80 or 90 AD, and we have actual artificial evidence from about 160 AD that the church just accepted that it was Luke that had written this. So there are people who disagree with that, but the reality is they're wrong. And for 2,000 years, the church has widely accepted that Luke Acts was written by Luke, who was the physician, who was a companion of Paul that we read about in both Paul's letters and in Acts. So it was written by Luke, same guy that wrote Luke. And that's really important, the Luke bit, because this is volume 2 of a 2-part work. We're reading Acts, but I would encourage you, if you've got time, or if you're thinking, what could I be doing for my morning readings, read through the Gospel of Luke, because this is really the to-be-continued part of the Gospel of Luke. So it's worth taking the time just to read through it. And we know this because right at the beginning of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 1 and verse 1, Luke writes this. Here we go. In my former book, Theophilus, I'll say more about him in a minute, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. So Luke himself links his previous book, Luke, with this one. And it begins in almost the same way because Luke begins his gospel account this way. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of these things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." So they're addressed to the same person. They are 2 volumes of a single work. Important that we remember that. So if we've got questions about what he's trying to write about in Acts, sometimes we can go back to Luke and just clarify what he said there. And we know from that, from what we've just read in Acts 1, that the purpose of writing Luke was so that we would understand all that Jesus began to do and teach. And I love that word began. He began to do and teach because Acts is what Jesus continued to do and teach. So for many of us, we might have grown up, and some Bibles might still have this, where the book is called the Acts of the Apostles. Now that's a mistake, Because this isn't the Acts of the Apostles at all. This is the continuing Acts of Jesus and the Holy Spirit through the apostles and some other men and women. But that would be long and clumsy, so we're just going to call it Acts for that case. But this is not about the apostles. This is about the ongoing, continuing work of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. As I said, it was written early, probably 80 or 90 AD. These things are going to take place somewhere around 50 AD. And so we know that there's a very short period between when they happened and when they've been written down for us. That's one of the things that can give us real confidence just in the fact that what is written is what actually happened. Because otherwise there would have been people around who went, whoa, 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 that's not what happened at all. So the Bible comes to us as a spiritual book, but it's also a real thing. And we ought to be able to be comfortable saying we're confident to defend what's written in this book because we can do things like say it was written around 80 to 90 AD, but the things that were taking place were between 50 and 60, 65 AD. It's really close together. But I also want to say that history writing back in the first century isn't the same as we typically think of history writing in the Western world today, where the job of a historian to write something down is just to write an unbiased, dispassionate account of what actually happened. Now, the idea that there's an unbiased, dispassionate account of what actually happened is just a lie, but that we don't have time to get into. But that's what we pretend to do. It's like we've got some sort of video evidence of this is exactly what happened in that moment. That's not what Luke is doing in Acts. He's doing what's called a historiography. That's easy for me to say, which is an ancient form of writing history, and it's not like a video recording. The writer is genuinely wanting to make a point. They're upfront about the point they're trying to make. He's trying to tell us about Jesus. And they organize their material in order to make that point. It's not that the stuff's untrue, it's absolutely true, but they can flex things like timelines in order to make their point. They can move something from one to another. So if you're ever reading the Gospels and get a bit confused about why one Gospel has this here and another one has it over here, well, one of the reasons is just because they weren't fixed to things like timelines the same way that we are, because they were doing a different thing. Does that make sense? Yes, nobody's lost their faith because I've just described how the Bible works, but that's what's going on. And one of the reasons for saying this is because there's a really important question that comes up. There's a whole load, I think 27% of the book of Acts is speeches. Okay? So if I asked you afterwards to go and write down what I'm going to be talking about, then that would, I suspect we would get some really interesting outcomes. There's those of you who are taking notes, you might get something that quite accurate-ish. Some of you are remembering, and you'll have highlights of what I did. And if there are any, and others of you will go, I can't remember a word he said. Come on, be honest. We've all done it Sunday afternoon. You're sitting there, you're having a cup of coffee, you're like, what was that about this morning? I have no idea. You know, the frightening thing is, I've been preaching sometimes. I think, what did we talk about this morning? I have no idea. The speeches are recorded, and the likelihood is it's things Luke's been around, things that have been recorded in some way, probably in some sort of verbal transmission to begin with. And they've been passed around among the Christians when they were first done. So, for example, Peter's sermon at Pentecost. There's not a scribe in the corner that was writing it all down as he did it, but there would have been Peter probably preached dozens of those messages. And so they began to form, and that Luke has done here is he's formed together that. Did Peter say exactly those words? I suspect not. I hope that doesn't cause you a problem. But did Peter say those words over the course of a period of time, and was it very similar to what he said on Pentecost? 100%. And we can have confidence in that. So there's lots of speeches, and then we're going to have loads of geography as well. We're all going to learn oodles and oodles about the Near East and the Mediterranean. And some of you will have been there. So what I want you to do is, if you've been to these places, places like Ephesus and to Jerusalem and to some of the other places in northern Israel, some of you have been to Crete, to Malta, to Cyprus, some of the Greek places referred to as Macedonia. If you've been to those places and you've got photographs and stories, then come and tell me, because what we'll do is we're going to try and liven it up. You don't just have to listen to me, but we'll get people come and tell us about what these places are actually like, and hopefully the book of Acts will come alive to us. So that's so geography as well. So that's the writing of it. The composition of the book, if we could skip on to the next slide, Zoe. Oh, I missed a point. Yeah, see, this is the problem with doing slides. So it's written to Theophilus. I should have said that. Beloved of God. Now, it's not clear whether Theophilus was an individual. He could very well have been. He could have been someone who was basically paying Luke to do this. Or it's possible he's writing to a community of people, the beloved of God, kind of like we see in the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, where he writes to a group of people but names them in a particular way. So it doesn't really matter which one it is, but it was just in case that was the question. And we just talked about historiography. Right, next one, Zoe. Composition of the book of Acts. How did it come to us? So I've decided that it's in parts. There are lots of different ways of splitting up. Some people split it in half. Other people want to follow Peter and then Paul, that kind of thing. I think there are 5 ways that come together, 5 sections that come together to hold the book of Acts together. And this is one of those things I'd like you to remember, because I think it'll be helpful as we go through, that you're thinking about, oh, this is the next section, or that's the section that we did look at before. So we have an introduction, which is chapter 1. And this is our previously on, so previously on the West Wing, and then we get the bit that happened. And if you watch the West Wing, then shame on you. Up your television game. What's happened before? A reminder of what happened at the end of Luke, and a kind of connection to just what's going to happen with Pentecost, and setting us up for the rest of the story. So that's our introduction, and we'll do that over the next couple of weeks, because there's some really important, rich stuff in there that we need to think about. The next section is chapters 2 through 7, and this is what we're going to get through before the end of the year. And this is the church being established in Jerusalem. So we have geographic location for these first 7 chapters. And we see this as the outflow, the Pentecost, which is the birth of the church, and then the outflowing of that, and the church beginning to figure out who it is, and then beginning to figure out how it operates in this urban area of Jerusalem among the Jewish people. And we're going to see this over and over and over again, but it's worth stating for clarity. When the church was birthed, it was a Jewish movement. This was not some complete split off. The idea was that they were a subset of the Jewish people. And one of the things we'll track through Acts is how that began to splinter and become something different. But these first 7 chapters are all about the church being established in Jerusalem and how the gospel being there. And we'll hear over and over again, and they were blessed, and the Lord added to their number, and with great fear people heard of what had happened. And so we're going to see how that out. But the community of faith is established in Jerusalem. Then the third section, which is chapters 8 through 12, the gospel goes to Judea and Samaria. And we see some of these absolutely brilliant stories. And really the gospel becomes accessible to Gentiles. That is everyone who is not a Jew in this section. Fourth section is Paul's missionary journeys, which is from chapters 13 through to 20. And then we get the witness to Rome, which is the last 7 or 8 chapters, from chapters 21 through to 28. And as Larry helpfully said, we finish in Rome, which is, in those days, was the end of the earth, both the center and the end of the earth. So what I want to suggest is that actually gives us our key theme, that section. So those are the 5 ways: introduction, church established in Jerusalem, gospel going to Judea and Samaria, the missionary journeys, and then the witness in Rome. So if we can go on to the key themes, the first thing is that if you think about that structure, I think it gives us our key theme, and the verse that is I'll get a row from Karen, the paradigm of this whole thing, the verse that sets up everything that's going on in the whole book of Acts. Acts 1:8. It is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, part 1, in and in all Judea and Samaria. That's our second section. And then the third section is, and to the ends of the earth, which is the missionary journeys, and then in Rome. And I think that's what's going on through the whole of the book of Acts. Acts 1:8 is being lived out through the whole of the rest of the story. So that's going to be one of the key themes, the way that verse in Acts 1:8 is being made real through the whole of the rest of the book. A couple of other themes that I think is really important for us to look at. One is Jesus is Lord. This is something that's going to come up time and time and time again. And if it's not there, I want you to assume it's there. That the church's earliest creed, the earliest thing ever said, was Jesus is Lord. And there's two things we have to remember about that. When we begin in Jerusalem, it's a Jewish community. And to say Jesus is Lord is to explicitly be saying Jesus is God. It's profoundly significant in the Jewish context. But it's even more significant in the Roman context. Now, the Roman Empire ruled all of the Mediterranean at that point. It's really through the Roman Empire that Paul is able to travel. But the Roman Empire at that point used to say, Caesar is Lord. And so this statement of the early church to say Jesus is Lord is both to say that Jesus is God, which is a challenge to the Jewish people, and to say Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not, which is a challenge to the Roman Empire. And that's going on underneath everything we read in the whole of the book of Acts. It's a really important theme. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's just sitting there. Second, then we've got this continuity between of Jesus, which we read about in the Gospel of Luke, and then the mission of the church. So it's not that the church now has this new thing to go and do. No, they're just carrying on and actually working out Jesus' life in them, in the world. Something about that. I read this line. The scientists among you will correct me if I get this wrong, but you get centrifugal force and centripetal force. Does anybody remember that from your science thing? Have we got anybody in here willing to admit they remember what that is? So if I've got this right, centripetal force drags things in. I'm looking at Doug because I know Doug's a scientist. He's going to correct me if I'm wrong. Am I right about that? Yeah? And then centrifugal force throws things out the way and away. Now, Israel had always had a vision of the world that was a centripetal thing. The whole world was going to come to Israel and worship God in the temple, right? That was the vision of Israel. This, the book of Acts, turns everything upside down. And rather being brought in, it's a throwing out. It's a centrifugal force, and the church goes to the ends of the earth and literally takes it with them. There's no gathering in, it's a scattering out. And we're going to see that theme over and over again, particularly in these first 7 chapters where we see that the church is the temple of God and how that's a theme that we're going to see. Next one, the church as the new people of God and the fulfillment of the temple and much of all that God's people were supposed to be. There are new people beholden not to human masters, but to Jesus alone. And so we'll see that theme come up over and over again. It's going to be this deep challenge that some of it's really provocative about how we live together as the people of God and what we do with our money and what we do with our time and how we serve the poor among us and how we take care of widows and orphans and all of these sorts of things that, well, just in my own reading, bent me a bit out of shape. So I'm sure it's going to do us all a bit of good to do that. Those are the themes I think we will see over the next while. I'm going to finish with this. The purpose of the book, written What's going on? Well, one of the books I read was by this guy, Achtermeyer, and some other people. It's a big, thick book on the New Testament that actually, in most times, is a real waste of time and not actually very good. But they nailed what they wrote about Acts. He says this: the purpose of Luke Acts, this 2-volume work, is primarily ecclesiological. In other words, it's about the church, focused on the invitation to participate faithfully as God's people in God's redemptive purpose. What's Luke's purpose for writing this? It's so that the church understands its invitation to participate in God's redemptive purposes in the world. That's why the book exists here. Does that make sense? So the actual quote has loads of words, but it boils down to this. The purpose of Acts is that we, the church here at Portobello Baptist Church, here in Edinburgh in Scotland, would understand that we are invited to participate as faithful followers of Jesus in God's redemptive purpose in the world. God has a redemptive purpose for Portobello and for Edinburgh and for Scotland. We believe that, right? We might need to do a bit of work on that one. That's more important than the oohs, right? We really do believe that. God has redemptive purpose in this community and in this city and in this nation. That must be what we believe. Otherwise, it will be devastating for us to try and share the gospel, because what? Is my best effort to share the gospel? No, God, it has a redemptive purpose for this place at this time. And the invitation, the purpose of Acts, is to invite us to faithfully work out what it means for us to join God in his redemptive purposes. God is at work, we get to join him. He's already baking in the kitchen, we just get to come make a mess, and we get to eat the cake at the end. It's awesome. But that's the invitation of Acts. That's the purpose. And hopefully now you know a little bit about the book of Acts, what's going on in it. And next week, we'll start with the previously on, and we'll get stuck into Acts chapter 1.